Alright, today we will be starting our unit on the Cold War, more specifically the early years, from its start shortly after World War II to the Red Scare of the 50s. We will end this lesson by looking at some films from the era that showed how McCarthyism was reflected in popular culture. To recap, some of what we learned about World War II. We had the Allies versus the Axis. On the side of the Allies were the two superpowers, the United States and the Soviet Union. It was an alliance out of necessity, an uneasy truce. The superpowers recognized the need for taking down Hitler and the Axis. Even though they were in agreement on this, it was clear the alliance would not last past the war. Why is that, I hear you asking? Well, it's simple, really. The Soviet Union was a communist nation, whereas the United States are capitalists. Let's compare the economic ideology, shall we? If we look at capitalism, we see that businesses are privately owned. Citizens live in a multi-tiered class system, meaning there's the upper class, middle class, the lower class, and even subdivisions of these, such as the upper middle or lower middle. Due to the nature of capitalism, people are free to move throughout the different classes and can start out life in the lower class and work their way up to the upper class, or even vice versa. Someone may start out in the upper and end in the lower. Under capitalism, there is a system called the free market. This implies that prices and productions are determined by competition between businesses. This free market determines everything from a person's wages to the amount of a product produced to the price charged for an item. Lastly, capitalism encourages growth and innovations in things such as technology or healthcare. Now, let's compare to communism. Under communism, the government owns businesses. Therefore, the government controls the wages, production, and prices. There is no free market to determine these. Under communism, there is, in theory, no classes. Everyone earns the same amount. Therefore, there are no upper, middle, or lower classes. Because of this, there is little to no incentive to improve oneself. With no profit, why improve upon technology that wasn't immediately beneficial to the government? So, as we can see, these two economic policies are vastly different. Capitalists were afraid of communism, and communism were afraid of capitalists. More on that later. Alright, so back to World War II. Towards the end of the war, what was known as the Manhattan Project was coming to an end. This was the development of the nuclear weapon. America, with the help of the other allies such as the United Kingdom, developed the nuclear weapon first. This information was kept secret from the Soviet Union, who were also attempting to build their own bomb. The first test was the Trinity bomb, detonated in the desert of New Mexico in July of 1945. Shortly after, on August 6, 1945, the bomb Little Boy was dropped over the Japanese city of Hiroshima, and on August 9th, 1945, the bomb Fat Man was dropped over Nagasaki. It became official. The United States had weapons of mass destruction, and the Soviets wouldn't catch up until 1949 when they tested their first bomb, codenamed First Lightning. After the war ended, the Soviets began acquiring states on the eastern bloc of Europe. If you take a look at this map, you can see where the Soviet Union pressed up against the eastern bloc or the democratic side of the continent. In 1946, former British Prime Minister Winston Churchill gave a speech in Fulton, Missouri, where he said an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Then, in the following year, on March 12, 1947, Truman gave a speech to Congress where he advocated aid to countries such as Greece and Turkey, where Soviet-backed militias were attempting to overthrow the established government. In this speech, Truman avoided directly naming the Soviet Union, but emphasized the need of the free market. Thus begins the Cold War. Remember earlier when I mentioned capitalists were afraid of communists? That's because capitalists feared communists coming into the country and spreading communism. This first happened after the initial takeover of communism in Soviet Russia during World War I, but didn't really hit its stride until Senator Joseph McCarthy claimed in a speech given on February 9th, 1950, that he had a list of 205 employees in the State Department that were secretly communist. This sparked the Red Scare. People began turning in anyone they assumed was a communist into the government. This resulted in hundreds being in prison and thousands losing their job. In reaction to McCarthy's claims, the Senate formed the Subcommittee on the Investigation of Loyalty of State Department Employees. What a name. Rolls right off the tongue. This committee later became known as the Tidings Committee, named after the chairman of the committee, Senator Millard Tidings. This was a committee formed to, as its longer legal name implies, investigate the claims put forward and find any communists within the State Department. In the opening of the committee, Senator McCarthy, pictured here, gave a speech presenting the claims against the 81 state employees he deemed a security risk due to their pro-communist agenda. Wait, I hear you say, 81? Wasn't it just 205? Yes. Why, yes, it was. Well, what happened to the other 124 people? We don't know. McCarthy never came forward with those names. Draw from that conclusion as you will. So, the Tidings Committee ran for 5 months as it investigated the claims. Finally, in July of 1950, the committee concluded and presented their findings. Not a single one of the 81 put forward were found to be communist or pro-communism. That's the end of McCarthy, right? He claimed to have over 200 communists, changed that to just 81, then those were proven incorrect? No. Senator McCarthy was incredibly popular with the public and continued to push the fear of communism onto the public. He claimed that the government was inadequately handling the threat communism posed to America. He even won re-election in 1952. He continued to spread fear and accused others of being too weak on communism. He smeared his political opponents in open investigations. Eventually, the Senate voted to condemn his actions in a 67-22 vote. After this vote, McCarthy finally took a back seat. McCarthy and the Red Scare had a major impact on American life in the 1950s. The United States already had a deep-rooted fear of communism, and McCarthy brought those fears to the table. He pushed them out for all to see. Americans began questioning their neighbors. They began wondering if maybe that person next door might be a communist. Let's take a break from the pure historical side of things and look at the influences this had on popular culture. I want to look at 2 similar but incredibly different films. First, let's watch the trailer for Invasion USA.
Thousands of Americans have died victims of this treacherous attack, but it will not go unpunished. War or no war, people have to eat and drink and make love.
A 24-hour shift for what? To make more money for you? We don't have to work for this rat anymore. I repeat, emergency announcement. Unidentified planes approaching New York. The red alert is on. There they are. That is the target.
Find us and take this station off the air.
They're coming into the building now.
We take over now.
Next, let's take a look at the better-known Invasion of the Body Snatchers.
But will you tell these fools I'm not crazy? Make them listen to me before it's too late. Listen to me. Please listen. If you don't, if you won't, if you fail to understand, then the same incredible terror that's menacing me will strike at you!
come from another world, spawned in the light years of space, unleashed to take over the bodies and souls of the people of our planet, bringing a new dimension in terror to the giant super scope screen.
Whatever intelligence or instinct it is that can govern the forming of human flesh and blood out of thin air is fantastically powerful, beyond any comprehension.
A cursed, dreadful, malevolent thing was happening to those he loved.
This isn't just an ordinary body, is it?
I never saw one like it. It looks unused.
The sensational star discovery of The View from Pompey's Head. And now an undreamed of horror makes her life and love a vortex of fear.
Jack!
Miles, where do they come from?
I don't know.
Suddenly, while you're asleep, they'll absorb your minds, your memories.
I don't want any part of it.
You're forgetting something, Miles.
What's that?
You have no choice.
From city to city, an incredible hysterical panic spreads. As the unimaginable becomes real, the impossible becomes true.
Stop and listen! Stop and listen to me! Listen! Listen! Listen to me! They're not human! Can't you see? Everyone! They're here already! You're next!
These two films show a general fear felt across America at the time. They feared the Soviets coming in and taking over America. Obviously, these two played on different types of invasions, with Invasion USA playing more into the fear of a straightforward invasion, bombing of cities, troops marching on the streets. However, Invasion of the Body Snatchers reflected a different kind of invasion. The slow, methodical takeover. Plant agents inside and slowly grow in numbers until you have control. This was the fear felt by Americans at the time. This was the fear that resonated most. After all, can you really trust your neighbor? What if you are next?